In this week's reading, I think when Deloria speaks about colonization, the first thing that really stood out to me was that the government did pretty much whatever it could, locally and federally, to take resources away from the lands that belonged to the indigenous people, and that the laws that were used oftentimes were used in kind of they would play with the words to make it work for whatever they needed. So, for example, the fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest, they would restrict the native indigenous people from fishing there because they wanted to, quote, preserve the fish, the local fish. But then during the salmon run, they would allow commercial fishermen to come in and fish the land or the waters to the extent that the population was totally depleted. So preservation wasn't really the goal. The goal was to preserve it for other purposes. And I think that that's kind of the pattern that we see in colonization, not just in the Pacific Northwest, but kind of with each kind of area locally and federally across the land, as colonization spread throughout the continent. The land was stripped for away from the indigenous people for profit, basically, and then it eventually was exploited, right? So I kind of think that is the big thing that happened, that we see that Deloria speaks about. I think one of the interesting things that came up in the reading was the idea of how Indians were viewed by the colonizers, by the white people. Basically, they were either villainized or kind of idealized, kind of one or the other, and sometimes both at the same time. And I thought that was really, really interesting. There's kind of this romanticism of what an American Indian should be, which oftentimes did not reflect what was true historically, right? Or more importantly, currently. And so there was this really misalignment with reality between what life was really like this book, I think, was mostly discussed like 1960s, 70s, but I think probably even extends some to today, what life was like for in the current period for indigenous people. I think one of the things that was interesting, they were talking about, or he talked about, speaking to a group in the late 60s, early 70s, and they asked if they still, I can't remember exactly, I think maybe it was lived in a teepee or something like that was based on media portrayal of what an Indian life should be like, or maybe stories told in the classroom or whatever, and it was asked with sincerity, but was way off the mark. And I had a similar experience. I was away at a camp with other students, and I was in Colorado, and I'm originally from Houston, Texas. And as a joke, I was like, yeah, I ride a horse to school every day. And the person really thought that I did, and I had to go, whoa, I actually live in a city in a really urban environment. You wouldn't ride a horse to school. So it's funny how even now, like, stereotypes kind of frame our understanding of a people or a place versus kind of like a realization of what it really is like. That's a much milder version with a lot less impacts than my story versus what happened to the Native people, but it's just a similar experience. I think the lack of knowledge of people, of understanding the current existence and state of affairs for Indigenous people kind of led to some things. One of the things that came up was the Gallup ceremonial and how it was being hosted by non-natives, and it was interesting to me that both Indigenous people, older Indigenous people, as well as like non-Indigenous didn't really see that as a problem, but the younger generation did. And so I thought that was a good example of kind of a misalignment or misunderstanding of a misappropriation is probably a better word of the Indigenous culture of the area. And then this was like at the very end of the chapters, but I thought one of the quotes that really stood out to me was, tribal religions have been trivialized beyond redemption by people sincerely wishing to learn about them. And I think that really resonated because I think as a white woman living in the United States, I think that my intention would always be to be sincere and to learn in a sincere method, and maybe misunderstand how in doing so that could trivialize someone's religion in an important way. And so that was just really something that was helpful for me in reflecting on these matters. The last thing, how does this help us understand Indigenous relationships to land and life? And I think the thing that connected to me most about this question was the excavation, the story about the Twin Cities group that went to excavate a village, and how a group of kids in a summer camp went to excavate the village, and then the Indigenous people were really angry and came and took their shovels and fully compensated people for what they took. So it wasn't like they were doing anything that was illegal or outright illegal, right? Or they were just saying, this is not right, this is not what we want to have happen. And then the outcry of the public and saying, well, we were trying to preserve your culture and your heritage. And it's interesting how obtuse people can be when they're trying to help, and understanding that I think kind of the quote here is that none of the whites could understand that they were not helping living Indians preserve their culture by digging up the remains of a village that had existed in the 1500s. And then it went on to say that the only Indians worth preserving were dead ones. And I think that the story itself shows the connection to life and land, and that in digging up the remains of a site from the 1500s, you're disturbing the ancestors, not only the land, right, but the ancestors of the Indigenous people that lived there. And so how would that be helpful in helping them in preserving their culture in any way, shape, or form, other than to disturb the peace of their ancestors, which would have ramifications in their religious ceremonies anyway. So and their connection with land and their connection with their identity, really to keep that and preserve that, we would need to keep the ancestors at rest where they are peaceably at rest, and honor that site as opposed to excavating it. And I think that was one of the great illustrations of a way that helped me understand the Indigenous relationship of life and land. That is it for this week. Thank you.